All right, let's just jump right in. If you look around, it really feels like we're living in a time of deep, deep contradiction, doesn't it? Our shared sense of what's real, it feels like it's shattering into a million pieces right in front of us. So in this explainer, we're going to try to piece together a map of this breakdown, using a series of critical texts that diagnose a war not just on facts, but on reality itself. This quote from one of our sources, wow, it just gets right to the heart of the whole thing. The argument is that our modern age isn't about some noble search for truth anymore. No, it's about a brutal, all-out war over who gets to control the story. It's a battle for your perception where victory goes to whoever can assign the meaning, not to whoever can prove a fact. So our first section here is going to unpack that core problem, this fundamental breakdown in our shared understanding of the world. One source actually gives this crisis a really powerful name. They call it the shattered logos. Now, this idea of logos it's fascinating. In classical thought, it's like the divine reason that orders the entire universe, the logic that holds it all together. So a shattered logos, well, that describes a world where that order just completely collapses. The texts argue that language itself gets corrupted, and reality begins to fracture under the constant, relentless pressure of contradiction and manipulation. To win this war on reality, the sources say there are basically three strategic laws. First up, if you can control the labels, you control the whole debate. Simple as that. Second, and you really got to get this one, bombarding people with contradictions, that's not a mistake. It's a tactic. It's meant to create confusion and paralyze your ability to think for yourself. And finally, the real endgame, using language not just to describe the world, but to literally create the world you want people to see. Okay, let's move into our next section and see how this whole war actually plays out at a societal level. I mean, what happens when truth becomes a battlefield? Well, our core institutions, they start to buckle under the sheer weight of all these competing interpretations. The sources argue that our political systems are starting to act less like governments and more like, well, like religions. This idea of a theocratic democracy describes a state where political ideology demands your absolute, unwavering belief. And questioning the system, that's not just seen as dissent anymore. It's treated like heresy. And this thinking, it absolutely extends to our economy. The argument here is that capitalism has become its own kind of faith. The market is the church, consumption is the one true path to salvation, and endless growth is the gospel. In a system like this, our economic choices aren't just practical, they're framed as moral, necessary acts of belief. And what about our culture? What happens there? We get what one text calls a carnival of compassion. This is a world where empathy becomes a performance, suffering gets turned into content, and virtue is just something you signal to get social points. It creates this grotesque spectacle where performing goodness becomes way more important than actually doing good. So this is a really crucial point. We have to understand the difference between authentic faith and the rigid ideologies that have taken its place. The sources argue that true faith, it leaves room for mystery, for humility, for doubt. But modern ideologies, they demand absolute, unquestioning certainty. One seeks wisdom, the other, it only seeks power. All right, let's shift our focus now. We've talked about the big picture, the macro level, but what does this constant war on reality do to us, to the individuals actually living inside of it? How does it feel when the very ground beneath your feet is constantly shifting? This personal account from one of the texts is, it's chilling, but it's also a perfect metaphor. When an individual's mind fragments, it desperately tries to piece itself back together. And the sources suggest our whole society is going through something similar, a kind of collective fragmentation that leaves every single one of us struggling to find a coherent self. This question, pulled right from the source material, is designed to be jarring. It's the logical endpoint of living in a world without a stable foundation, because when everything outside of you feels like a performance or a lie, you eventually, inevitably, start to question the reality of your own existence. And this leads to this brilliant, kind of twisted paradox that the texts point out. Society screams at us, be authentic, be yourself. But at the exact same time, it demands we package and market a version of ourselves for everyone else to consume. The result is what the sources call the hollow self, an identity that's perfectly produced for others, but leaves a complete void on the inside. This chaos in society is mirrored by a psychological battle inside our own minds. The sources connect our culture of nihilism to the Freudian idea of thanatos, the death drive. See, when the life drive, Eros, our instinct for connection, love, and creativity is starved, the death drive, our instinct for self-destruction and aggression, is what gets fed. Okay, so after all of that, which is a pretty bleak diagnosis, is there a path forward? Is there a way out of this? Well, this final section of our explainer turns to the solutions and the paths to renewal that are proposed in these texts. The very first step, according to the sources, is to recognize a hidden war, the war on stillness. Modern culture is basically an architecture of distraction. It's designed to fill every single quiet moment with noise. And why? Because a person who is still might actually reflect. A person who reflects might start to question things, and a person who questions is a threat to a system built on illusion. So, the proposed antidote is what's called a pedagogy of reality. This isn't about job training, it's about completely reorienting education back towards meaning. It's about teaching how to think by nurturing a sense of wonder, carving out spaces free from tech, so we can finally escape the noise and start asking the big why questions again. And this all builds into a much broader vision for renewal. It's not just about individual change. The sources are calling for a rebuilding from the ground up, strengthening our local communities, demanding integrity from our leaders, and creating public spaces where real, genuine dialogue can actually happen again. It's about rebuilding the very foundations of a humane society.
This incredibly powerful biblical reference, used in the source material, frames the ultimate choice we all face. It's not just political or social, it's a spiritual decision. The path of nihilism and fragmentation, that's presented as a curse, as a form of death. The alternative, the blessing, is the hard, conscious work of choosing life, choosing meaning, and choosing truth.
And so we end with that same question, aimed directly at you. Because in this war on reality, none of us are just passive observers. We are all active participants. The sources have laid out the battlefield and the stakes. The choice of how we engage, what we believe, how we act, and what we choose to build, that choice is ultimately our own.